I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
This is Andrew Wittstadt, and you are listening to Heavy Board, and we're recording this on October 7th, 2025. My guest today is Dennis Brennan. Dennis is an attorney and a historian who specializes in the intersection of politics, justice, and history, taking a wide-angle lens on the events of the past and present. And on top of all that, listeners, Dennis is also a writer. His latest book is called DC Swamp Strikes Back. The book focuses on two of history's most controversial figures, Aaron Burr and Donald Trump, exploring the similarities between the two political firebrands and following Burr's awful decline after the duel that ended Alexander Hamilton's life. And of course, Donald Trump's many indictments. And it is a pleasure to welcome him onto Heavy Board today. Dennis Brennan, welcome to Heavy Board.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I appreciate you taking the time out of the day to speak with me.
Of course. A question we always start this with all the artists and writers, everybody that comes on here, we like to ask, what was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? How did these early years start to form, Dennis?
Okay. That's I grew up in Illinois in a small village just outside of Chicago called Marionette Park. It's about 2,300 residents. It's, it was a good childhood though, a small village, everybody knows everybody. You wandered maybe a little bit into Chicago for baseball, football, those kind of things. Then a little bit more when you went to high school. But other than that, everything was kind of in that small little village. They had like one grocery store, a couple of gas stations, and that was it. A big prairie with the baseball fields where we played Little League. My parents came from Ireland. They met here, but they're immigrants, legal immigrants, I should say, since that's very controversial now. But they met here. There were five of us. I was the second. I have an older brother and then younger siblings also. So it was a good childhood. Dad worked hard for a living. We didn't have a lot of money, but people in that area really didn't. It was mostly people working as truck drivers or warehouse workers, which my dad did. And, and then my mom also worked at times, as we grew up, waitressing. So working class background, I'd say. Yeah. So when people say that, I'm not lying. They made me work too. I had to go to work at, 15, doing jobs that I was very bad at, washing dishes and being a busboy. And eventually then I worked at a grocery store as I went to college and law school.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the short. I tried to keep it short, but maybe went long.
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Yeah. When was this? Was this the 70s, 60s? When?
Yeah, I was born in the 60s. So, between the 60s and the 70s, graduated high school, 79.
Okay.
So, yeah. I didn't go far for college. I was, college is St. Xavier, which is like the local. I commuted and I worked. So I didn't go very far, actually. Yeah. Not the world traveler.
Yeah, is there what's the dividing line there? Is that part of Illinois? Are they Cubs fans or White Sox fans? Is that the dividing line in the
generally
city?
If you're on the south side like I was, you're a Sox fan. North side is the Cub fans, but that's anymore people have moved so much.
Right.
You can't buy into that anymore.
Right.
And we grew up down the street. There were people that were Cub fans,
right.
Some of it was based on how their team was doing or whatever. And, I think over the years, I think some of the Cub fans switched to the Sox. They might have switched back by now. I don't know,
Right. Yeah.
depending on how they're doing.
Yeah. The curse of the Bambino and are going around to everybody's teams. Uh,
Right. There's always a curse.
yes, yes. The next question is always, when did reading and writing come into your life? And for you, this gets a little broader, but you could throw history in there too. When did history, reading, writing, when did that all come into your life? Is that something that happened early, something later in life, when you were in law school? When did that come
Yeah.
in and become like a part of your daily existence, reading and writing and studying history?
Yeah, I think high school we read a lot, but it really didn't take place. The amount of reading you have to do in law school,
Right.
I think, blows everybody's mind. Even though
Yeah.
it's case law, it's every day you have to be prepared because they're going to call on you, and you have to know this, case or several cases for different classes. So you kind of get used to that idea, and there's no cliff notes. And if there are, it doesn't do you any good because all the law professors know the trick. So they're asking questions beyond the basics. So you have to know that. But I'd say, in college, I my major was journalism, so I was very involved in writing then. I thought that's what I was going to do,
Right.
really. But when I graduated from college, I think there were like two job possibilities. One was having me move to Iowa for a radio station. I think it paid $12,000, and the other one was Arkansas. I think that was a radio job too. I forget now; it's so long, and that was like 9,000. And to give you some kind of idea, I was working in a grocery store, a major chain, and I was making 14,000 working part time.
Right.
Well, being the financial wizard, I said that doesn't make sense. I took the LSAT test, my last, in college, based on one of the professors saying, "Well, you should take this." So I did, just out of a lark, um, and I did well on it. And the day, funny thing is, the day after that, uh, the test was on a Saturday. On Sunday, I was playing football and broke my arm. So I would have had a tough time doing anything for the rest of, for several weeks after that. They had to put a plate in. So in school, all the professors were very nice about it. They let me tape record, tests, and I didn't have to write anything. So the actual pen and paper, which we used then, became obsolete for me. I was the tape recorder guy, which was nice, but it was good timing because I don't think I could have taken the LSAT. I would have missed that time and had to wait 6 months or whatever it is.
Right. Did you play football when you were in school or anything, or was it just messing around?
No, it wasn't. This was more of a pickup
Right.
thing.
Yeah,
With
yeah.
the sport stuff. As a kid, a little bit, but mostly, baseball.
Right.
Football was always too small. I was told too small, too slow, bad combination.
Yeah.
Um, and I could see the too small part. I could see both parts
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
That did describe me. If there was a scouting report, you're too small and you're too slow, kid.
Yeah. Yeah. That's always fun too. I just
Hmm.
asked because yeah, I played football in high school and all that, so I'm always just curious how that
Yeah, I
goes.
always found it to be fun, although perhaps not very good at it. But it's a great game to play anyhow.
Yeah, yeah, it really is like a very American, I mean, up there with baseball and football, I mean, are the big, yeah, what else? How much more American can you get with those two there? The next
Right.
the next question is always, who are some of your go-to inspirations in the world of letters? Who are writers that you're enamored with, historians that you're enamored with? And let's make this a little broader for you too, maybe even like your first kind of big, rabbit hole, let's say, when you get into history and you discover something and you start chasing all the documents and stuff. I don't know. What what
Yeah.
what were some of the inspirations that led you down this path to write books and study history and all that on top of being an attorney and everything else?
Yeah. I think part of it, it's probably twofold because I had this, you know, interest in politics for some
Yeah.
reason. And which, part of that, I told her my dad worked in a warehouse. His second after the warehouse closed, he went to work for Cook County, political job, but part of that is you're out precinct captain. And I recall, helping him with that, going door to door, which I found to be fun. I don't think he really thought it was fun.
Right.
That you had to knock on doors and get neighbors to vote for your, choice. And, so part of the Democratic machine at that time, he was at least, and I guess I was helping. And, part of that is when you start seeing a lot of the different politicians, you start reading about them. So I started reading about, presidents, going back Washington, Lincoln, Kennedy. We're an Irish Catholic family, so Kennedy was like, was the Pope, then Kennedy. Sometimes Kennedy was above the Pope, I think. But, and then you start reading about their families. I kind of transformed from Democrat politics. I was elected in that same village, Marionette Park, as a trustee when I was 25. And I was on the library district, the village. I left after 4 years. I didn't run again, ran for a township position. So I thought at that point, hey, I might make a run at this stuff politically. But I also had a few losses in there.
Yeah.
I think, so I had served as a village trustee out where I live now in Hinsdale. I was on the high school board and on the grammar school board. And the high school board, I was president of the board for 6 out of the 8 years I was on there. And it was interesting, but it's not really a career. You don't get paid for that.
Right.
You're doing it trying to make the community better in your mind. You think you're making it better. Some of the people would disagree and say I didn't make it better. And and you hear from them. You hear more probably from them than you do the people that are in agreement. But so at some point in there, I also ran, I think it was for county board. I did not win that. After that, I said, maybe the people don't think I'm that great as far as they'll put me in a high school board or something, which is great. But to make a career out of it, I didn't think that was going to be my way. So I think some of that interest comes through that love of politics, which has really become harder to love, honestly.
Yeah.
And I think some of it too is, after college, I worked for a community newspaper. I even owned one at one time. So I did some writing mostly on politics and community events and things happening, which always was intertwined with the politicians. So I found that interesting. I think it just expanded into the whole historical look. And, now I think, just even researching the book, you find, to start researching about Aaron Burr, you really start digging deep. Trump's a little easier because he's happening before our eyes. And a lot of research now is easier because you got the internet. They at least get you the sources, then you can pull the books or order them or whatever. It's kind of a lazy man's way of researching. It's like, oh, Amazon has a book on, Burr. I'll order that. And it's at your house the next day. You're like, okay, I'll read it. But, I do think reading, and some of it too is like we grew up with the newspapers. There were, I think there were 5 newspapers at one time, including a kind of a local community paper. But, Chicago had the Tribune, the Sun-Times, which are still around, the Chicago Today, and the Daily News. 2 came in the afternoon, 2 were in the morning. My dad was all over newspapers and reading them. And, we kind of started out reading the sports section.
Right.
And then it became, then their interest, maybe there's other stuff in this paper, and you start moving forward. And, by the time you're, certainly by college, but late high school, and we had some of that too in the schools. Our grade school, even, they would have the Tribune delivered. I think we were in 7th or 8th grade, and you were kind of made to read it, which is probably the best way to get people interested. I think, you start reading, you're like, oh, there's a lot of news in here I didn't know about. So it became interesting, I think, in that way.
Yeah, you know, you're not the first guest to mention this. We had another guest on that said something similar, and she grew up in like Houston area, and she said,
Mhm.
those local papers, the local papers where you'd have these local writers that would be these local columnists that were covering national stuff, whether it be sports or politics or whatever it is. But then you got to kind of like know them, you know, you got to kind of look forward to their columns, you know, and that extended to the national stuff still too. You know, the only ones that are left now are some of the big national papers, right? So, you know, I still look forward to certain writers' columns and stuff. You know, I usually read Peggy Noonan's column or something in the Journal. You know, I like to read
Mhm.
Douthat's columns in the Times. You know, they're just kind of little things, but it's not quite the same as having that local person that's living in your city with you and is talking about the local stuff, you know, with the national stuff. And it is something we're missing. And, you know, obviously people have said this. This is an original thought, listeners, but yeah, it's just so interesting how that plays out. Were any of the you know, the big American political texts? So I'm thinking, you know, Thomas Paine or something. Were any of those like big inspirations to you at any point, or you just always kind of had this hobby of politics? Like,
Yeah, I think it was more oriented towards the politics of it. I mean, somewhat, you know, you hear things in history and you think, whether you're reading it in class or wherever, and, you know, I have to look that up. But I find myself looking up more now than ever. You know,
yeah,
you start saying, I need to know more about this because, you know, it's kind of the shallow overview. And maybe we were always getting that, but we were satisfied then. Now it's like, hey, I didn't know that. And you start researching it yourself. And, you know, we're living in a time now where you can research things. I mean,
right,
sure, you might have to cut through what, you know, what's a good source, what's not. I mean, here, some of that reading and, you know, the love of certain writers. It's funny, like we had in Chicago, Mike Royko was the big columnist. He was great. And I don't know if they'll ever have another Mike Royko, you know, because so many people would talk about what he wrote. And
right,
even then I thought, wow, that's like I knew grown men at that time that were saying they wish they had, you know, his ability or they had his following that, you know, and I thought, you know, as a student watching that, like, wow, this guy really captures, you know, a thought that maybe a lot of people have, but he has a way of putting it into something that's either, you know, funny but also insightful and makes you want to, you know, be involved. I mean, some of those guys, you read it and you thought, yeah, he's right. Government's
right,
not running the right way. I could do this better. I was taking it from that end that I think I could be the politician that does it right. Now, he probably would have wrote about me too and said I did something wrong because I
right,
think he was one of those guys, and that's what I miss in journalism today is he hit everybody. He
right,
didn't, you know, it wasn't just Mayor Daley at that time. It was, you know, if the Republicans, he'd hit them too.
right.
If they did something or in his mind they stepped out of line, he was calling them on it. And, you know, so I see that value of writing, you know, in the there and now. And then the historical part, it's important to get it down into these books where it's there forever,
Right.
hopefully. And, and people will have like this, you know, documentation that something happened. And I get some of it has opinion in there, but
Yeah.
overall, you're getting the history of what happened. And, you know, maybe it's not perfect history, but it's something that we remember. You know, and some of those stories you hear, you know, going back about presidents, you wonder like, is that really true?
Right.
Like, you know, and I think some of that there's different stories told on Lincoln, on like
Right.
slavery, and well, he was really reluctant, but in school they don't portray him as
Right.
reluctant. He's the guy that's out there doing it. And you're like, well, it might be a little different than what happened. I'm not sure there's a harm in it, you know,
Right.
right?
Well, I mean, that the main thing too. That's one thing, that movie Lincoln, that the Spielberg movie or whatever, where they don't show it how probably as contentious as it probably was, but you know, I like that they did show him. You know, he was buying votes to get that passed. Like he had to bribe people to get that passed. It was not some, oh, he had, you know, pure of heart, whatever his intentions, you know, all that stuff. But it was this kind of, it was more of a political move than people like to admit. And talking about that stuff too, like, I think the beat reporters you were saying, these beat reporters,
Mhm.
where that just doesn't exist anymore. It used to be we had all you already said you had 4 or 5 local papers in a big
Yeah.
city like Chicago, and somebody's job that would make 40K a year or something in today's dollars, probably a decent living. You just follow your local school board and you'd go to all the locals, and you were the school board
Yeah.
beat writer, and that's what you did. And maybe it's not what you really wanted to do, but you did that to work your way up to do some political stuff, bigger profile stuff. But that just doesn't exist anymore. And then the kind of the grooming mechanism for these journalists too has kind of not existed anymore. So now Ivy League colleges are kind of doing the grooming process for who's going to get a seat on the New York Times masthead, instead of these kind of having a following build up in, a big city like Chicago or DC or Philly, some of these other places to slowly build up, and then you get the job at the national, paper
Yeah.
or magazine, and you can kind of branch out some more. But like, so that's been a problem, the bipartisan, and we're going to get into all this too. Everybody's hungry for a bipartisan take on things because it's so rare. It's so rare now. It's so rare to have people literally sit back and just, okay, everybody's playing for their team. Everybody's playing red or blue. So you do have to be more wary of it. My introduction to politics as a young man was in college with that. And I was never somebody who was very into it. But, Christopher Hitchens was a big, big influence on me. And it kind of, you know, he was very good at debate and all that, obviously, and he loved the theater of debate and was very good at playing that up. But like, some of his writings too were just kind of like he was willing to make some arguments, particularly towards the end of his life there during the Iraq War. He was willing to take some heat for making an argument that would people didn't like him. His side or his
Mhm.
political side did not like it when he was writing about those types of things. And yeah, that's. I mean, we'll get into that as it comes up. We don't have to with the Iraq War stuff, but yeah, I know that was
Yeah.
his big break from he was always kind of this socialist on the left, and then the Iraq War thing happened, and he kind of broke from that and was writing all these pieces, articles and arguments, and quite good and convincing. Frankly, I've gone back and read them since, 20 years after the fact, and the guy wasn't playing around. They're solid arguments for what he was arguing for, and yeah, it's just interesting
Yeah.
how that plays out. As you age, as you grow, as you mature, your politics change, your priorities
Yeah.
change. All these things. Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to get into that. So like this kind of let's get into the books here and the kind of the paths you've drawn for readers here to follow through the book. I said, let's start with Burr. I think
Yeah.
most listeners probably don't know that much about Burr besides, the kind of duel thing. Give listeners kind of the overview of how Burr's, brand of politics got him into the history books. And we can go,
Yeah.
as detailed as you want on this. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the overview first, it's like Burr wasn't really aligned with anybody. He was, for lack of a better term, I guess, independent. They weren't sure where he was going to go. What party is he going to be with? And, he impressed some people with his speaking ability. He was an attorney. He was, in the legislature, and he made a big speech on the Jay Treaty, and people were like, wait a minute, this guy could be something. We could make him, part of our party,
Right.
and which appealed, to some of the Jefferson people. But Burr, not, at that time, anybody in politics, you didn't have, the Bill Clinton story, the poor kid from
Right.
Little Rock. You were going to come from a well-off family.
Yes.
Burr's dad started Princeton University, so it gives you some idea of where he's coming from.
Right. Yes.
I don't think there was anybody, no coal miner's son there, but so he wasn't, and I don't think he was sure where he wanted to go either. But I think he was not. I think other people didn't know that he was a pretty good, politician and knew how to maneuver, for lack of a better word. I think he showed that in the first race. He ran twice for vice president with Jefferson. Jefferson lost the first time when he ran against Adams. Second time he won, and the real reason that I find in the research is, Jefferson didn't change anything. He was the same guy that is the first race. What changed, besides what Adams had done in office, was Burr went back to New York in the interceding time. And at that time, the electoral votes were decided by the state legislature. So he went back there, made sure he elected the people that would be with him and with Jefferson, and turned New York basically to his side. And that actually caused some, trouble with the other people there. There were like 4 families that controlled New York. Alexander Hamilton was part of that.
Right.
And because of that, that's one of the many reasons Alexander Hamilton and him did not get along, because when you're trying to take it all for yourself, and that's still true in politics now, you get a lot of people that are now your enemy because you're moving up, they're not, and so forth. And it's hard when you're in those races to kind of say, well, it's just a race. Well, we move on, we shake hands. They weren't shaking hands then either. They were obviously, they dueled eventually. But Burr brought in the New York vote, allowing Jefferson and him to get the same amount of votes as the one time we had a tie. Back then, if the vice president and the president tied, there was basically a second vote within the Congress to decide who becomes president, which sounds crazy.
Right.
I mean, why would that even happen? Burr at that point went back home and didn't do anything. Some of the Jefferson people thought Burr should have stood up and said, wait, I ran for vice president. Vote for Thomas Jefferson. He's the president. I'm just the vice president. You'd like to think you would do that and I would do that. But then again, if we're close to being president, we might not, right?
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, I could be president. Burr didn't lift any fingers to do that. He also didn't make any deals to, cut a deal for himself. Jefferson did make a deal.
Right.
And he promised certain, spoils to the other side if they would put him in. At that time, Hamilton was working against Burr. And so were, some of the other people from Virginia who they had a plan that there'd be a Virginia president for many, many years. And they did, get that with Madison, Monroe. Burr was kind of in the way. He was the New Yorker, kind of the outsider. So he was picking up enemies and not really knowing, which I think I tie in the book, that Trump was picking up enemies and then kind of not knowing it.
Yeah.
That he's, when he got to Washington, I think in his mind, it's hard to say that Donald Trump's naive.
Right.
But I think when he did get elected, he was naive about how Washington works.
Absolutely. I think you could see it. Yeah.
And he relied on some people there because he didn't know what to do. Like, okay, these are the guys. And those weren't the best ideas for him personally or his career. And I think, he didn't realize, hey, it's gloves off. You're in Washington. Right. You're not a village trustee in Marionette Park or something where we had battles, but we didn't, but we kind of knew who our friends were and who, our opponents were. Here, I think he thought he was going to be loved just as he was as a celebrity. Burr kind of fell into that same trap. And then when it fell apart, for Burr, he had the duel, which should have, it kind of did wreck his career. Yeah. And all, in history, they'll teach you in class, like that was it. Right. They might touch upon the Spanish conspiracy, which has been renamed the Burr conspiracy, where they claim, Burr was raising an army. He was conspiring to, go into the western part of the country, which was Spain land, and Mexico was part of it. And
Louisiana Purchase. Yeah.
Right. He was going to go to war.
Yeah.
And now, lucky for him, they couldn't prove that, but a lot of the historians say it's true.
Yeah.
And there's now a growing number of people that have looked at it and say at least there wasn't evidence of it.
Right.
And that's kind of where I fall. Is there evidence of it? A little bit, but there's not enough to convict someone of treason.
Right.
And that's where he kind of gets lucky, but his career's over at that point. And, and we balance that out with how Trump, with all the the many cases,
Yeah.
the indictments, the lawsuits, that he faced and how he battled against those things, and ended up being victorious because he's back in the White House. So,
Right. It's always interesting, like you mentioned this with, I think that especially because with social media, there's been this explosion in interest in politics, as like politics was something for, yeah, usually a certain class of people who are very into politics. And it's
mhm,
usually, yes, the elite class listeners. Yes, the people that went to Harvard and Princeton, et cetera, et cetera. That was usually historically the thing. But now it's this broad, all through the 20th century and so on and so forth, it's for everybody and everybody can participate in it, blah, blah, blah. But like, there is this, I think, naivete, like a general naivete around what this machine is. Like, I think you see it in even somebody who's the total opposite of somebody like Trump, like AOC or something, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York. She ran on a kind of a revolutionary platform. Oh, we're going to get in there, we're going to bust butts, we're going to get in there, we're going to make changes, and we're going to do it for the people. And then she got in the machine, right? She won the House, and you see it kind of went away. It kind of got toned down, where she kind of got put in her place. She gets in there, and then
mhm.
these old dogs, Schumer, Pelosi, they get in there like, honey, you need to sit down for a minute. Okay, like this isn't how it
Yeah,
works. You need to earn your spot here. You're a freshman congressman. No, we're not putting your bill on the floor. We need your vote for this, and then 5 years later, maybe we'll get, this is just how it works. You're not gonna to come in and be some revolutionary that's gonna change everything. Good luck. Okay, like good luck. Like this
right.
is a machine that is bigger than all of us, bigger than Trump,
Yeah,
bigger than these things. Like it is gonna keep churning away. And if you get caught in that cog, it will just smash you and keep on going. Like if you're like, oh, I'm gonna be an
yeah,
honorable one and never lie, it's like, okay, good luck, dude, because it's gonna eat you alive, that machine. And that they call it the
right.
swamp, which I want to get to with that. But yeah, please go
Mhm.
on. Please go on.
Yeah, and I think you're looking. AOC is a good example. The way we communicate now with social media, and it's become they can't crush you like they were able to crush Aaron Burr.
Right.
You know, even between the duel and then you've got this conspiracy where people are getting their news and thinking this guy's treasonous. I mean, we use treasonous is used so much now. I don't know that
Hmm.
it has any value
Right.
because
Yes.
these people they'll say it's treasonous. No, they're not really taking up arms against our nation. So it might be something else. They might be guilty of something else. Poor judgment for one thing, but
Right. Yeah.
you know, you see a who's huge on the fundraising on the Democrat side.
Yeah.
A lot of it is social media and her personality and so yeah,
And then
she
she's
might not
pretty,
be
she's a pretty young girl, gorgeous, and she's up there, yeah, doing her Instagram lives and talking about whatever. And she's very,
it's
it helps that you're attractive and all. Yeah, of course,
it
yeah,
does. And I
yeah.
think the now whether you're effective as a
Right.
congressman, it doesn't matter.
Right.
What matters is you got your group of people. I mean, and Bernie Sanders, who I don't know anybody would say is attractive, has
Right.
built out
Right.
a big following,
Yeah.
and it's people who are disaffected. It gets to the point where who participated in politics. Well, back in Aaron Burr, it was the elite. A lot of people couldn't even read,
This
so
is
they're not
a,
really participating.
this is a kind of a,
Now,
no, please go on before I don't want to interrupt
well,
you if you're going through
no,
the point.
now you've got anybody can. You've got the
Yes.
schools, where Charlie Kirk would be,
Right.
at the schools trying to raise interest, and I think by and large did raise interest. I think Bernie back in 2015, Bernie Sanders raised a lot of interest among young
Yeah.
people, and AOC I think has too.
Oh, yeah.
And we always add, it's funny because as voters generally, I think we are always saying we want someone new, someone who's not part
Right.
of all this. And then when we do get those people, whether it's Trump or
Right.
whether it's Bernie Sanders or it's like or AOC, we're like, well, I didn't mean that. I
Right.
meant
Not the way
I
I
meant
wanted
within
it.
the
Yeah.
confines of follow the leaders and well, that's the same thing that's been going on forever. If you just follow Mitch McConnell and you follow
Right.
Pelosi and they want you to for sure. They
I'm
want
look.
it to stay the same.
I'm actually. This is. You're saying these things. I want to go in all these different directions, Dennis. I'm sorry. I like you. These are great
Okay.
ideas. Yeah. McConnell That's one that, I'm looking forward to when his biography and all that starts coming out. Once he's gone and we start treating him like people aren't as, once somebody's dead, they're not as vitriolic. Although who knows, you see what happens nowadays with that. They usually can step back and view the person's career for what it was. I mean, obviously it's not working as well as it used to. His time's kind of done. But when you see like his tactics, this guy was a master of politics, and it is so fascinating to see how that worked, like how he got things done, how he got this kind of used the rules of the Senate and stuff to his advantage to like get policies passed or hold up policies. Very, very people are like, oh, I'm like, come on, this guy is way too smart for people to be brushing him off as a fool or something or some villain. I mean, this guy is very intelligent, and we should. But then, I wanted to ask you this. I didn't even plan to ask you this because I was thinking more Burr and Trump. But I was thinking, what would you make of the Bernie Sanders kind of rise here? Because as you were describing it, I almost wanted to compare it to Burr here. And maybe he wasn't as good at coalition building and deal making. But I always think of maybe the reason Bernie got so much attention. Obviously, he was saying things, but he was bucking some of the traditional party trends, on the Democratic side that got himself into some trouble. And I mean, there are people that say that he was forced out both times that he ran because of that, because he was bucking, the immigration policies. He wasn't quite on board with the kind of, the general standard of the Democratic policy at that point. He was in favor of certain other things that, they just weren't on board with. And it cost him, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it's a cutthroat world. I was just curious. Yeah, what's your take on with your thoughts on the Bernie Sanders phenomenon? Like, does that relate to Aaron Burr and Trump at all? Or
I think the one thing about Bernie Sanders is he certainly has pulled the party, the Democrat Party, hard left.
Right.
Much more so than it ever. I don't think people say, well, John F. Kennedy would have been a Republican if he was around now.
Right.
I don't know about that. But I do think just in recent history, Bill Clinton compared to where Bernie Sanders is,
right,
they're very far apart.
Yeah.
And Clinton may have talked about some things, but he really didn't do them.
Yeah.
And Bernie has been successful at pulling the party that way. Now, whether that'll ever result, I mean, I think he's mid-80s.
Yeah, he's getting up there. And he's gotten penalized in some ways too. They've been kind of like, they drag him out for fundraisers and stuff, but then they kind of put him in the closet, for the things we're like, well, shut up about that. We don't want to pass that, get out of here, old man, But
I think some of that has been like, he realizes you're not going to be like, I don't know who does the talking with him, but it's like, you're not going to be able to pass that and you're going to cost us votes. But we'll make the deal. We'll do it later. I think the Biden administration was a lot of that, where, hey, just be quiet, take a seat, and we'll take care of all these things in the administration, even though we're not campaigning on that, because by and large, most people don't want what you're selling. The party might. The Democratic Party, I think, does, but I don't think the country as a whole does. So Bernie, it's an interesting, study at some point to compare him to someone else in history who has moved their party, but really hasn't. I mean, being a senator is no small deal,
right?
And he's done well for himself. He's a multi-millionaire. He's been a senator for a while. He has affected policy. It'll be interesting to look at, is there someone else who's done that? Certainly, maybe it was Goldwater, I don't know, who pushed the party, didn't get the big prize. I'm just thinking in my head, like I could write another book.
Yeah, please.
I think, you see that and you're like, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate that these guys who are so strict in their thinking where a party should be or a country should be, never really get the big payoff of the presidency. But they do, move things along. I don't know if they make it better. They think they do. And it's an interesting study of Bernie Sanders. And now, it looks like AOC's the one picking up the baton when and if Bernie passes that baton. But he's still a fundraising force. He still is moving the party. And I suspect, that'll be the case for, 2028. if
Right.
he's still active. Age,
Right.
catches up with people at different times.
Yeah.
But he seems to have groomed AOC for that part,
Yeah.
and she's got a following the same way. But so we'll see.
Yeah. That's very interesting how that plays out. Yeah. With all that. All right. So we got the Burr's kind of overview with this
Yeah,
and his brand. Now I want to kind of lay out the kind of Trump story and its similarities to the Burr history. Again, you can do overview, you can do detail, we can get into a specific thing.
yeah,
However you want to approach that, yeah, with the kind of the comparison, because the book, listeners, Dennis's book compares these two, this historical figure of Aaron Burr, and then of course the historical, well, yeah, gonna be historical figure of Donald Trump here, as we're still living it, so it's not quite in the history books yet, but yeah, so get kind of the overview for the Trump angle on this too. How did you want to see these two and want to compare them in this way and write this book?
yeah. I mean, it started a friend of mine who's a Democrat political consultant. He's done congressional races. Lloyd Boterney. He wrote a book about Aaron Burr, and he brought it to my office and gave me a copy. And I'm like, okay. And he said, hey, I read it. He came back about 3 weeks later. It was an interesting book. I learned a lot about Aaron Burr, and it started piquing my interest to look into more books about Aaron Burr, as sometimes happens, because you start seeing things that you didn't know about. But the thing that kept striking in my head was what Burr went through. It was the constant battles. Like, they tried him for treason in Missouri. It's dismissed. They drag him across the country to try him in Washington. It's like, wait a minute, this is sounding familiar.
Right.
Like Trump has these cases everywhere. So when Lloyd came back to the office, he said, we had a little sit down, and he said, "What do you think?" I'm like, well written. He's a good writer, no doubt. But I think you missed the story. And because he's a Democrat consultant,
Right.
he wasn't going to buy what I was saying. But I said, what they did to Burr is the same thing they're doing to Trump. And he looked at me like, a lot of Republicans look at AOC or something.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
get out of here.
Right.
But I said, well, if you're not going to fix that with like a follow up, I'm going to write a book. And I started doing the research on Burr, and some of the stuff he was saying, he was sure Burr was innocent of treason. I'm not as sure, but I think there's not the evidence to convict, and maybe that's the lawyer part where you say,
Right.
you have to. And I've thought this was Trump too with his cases. You might have something,
Right.
but do you have enough to convict him for this? And are you actually following? Are you going for justice when you file all these cases across the
Right.
country, and you start saying, well, like I've had people say to me, well, it's wrong he has documents. Well, he's not the first guy, and I would
Right.
also note that we classify too many documents
Right.
as a country. Everything I think is stamped classified,
Right.
so you can't pass it out to the people. We don't get to know anything. It's the deep state keeping everything to themselves. And then you find out years later, they were doing what?
Right.
You're like, I didn't know that. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, because they classified it and didn't release it for 30 years, and now you don't really care. But, I think with Trump, the cases were the big thing. There's you start with the fights when he got into Washington, as we mentioned earlier, that, I don't think he was prepared.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of never serving as a senator
Yeah.
or even a governor.
It's-
Those that have been in politics, even if you're at a lower level, you realize the people making laws with you and working with you aren't necessarily your friends.
Right.
Your friends are when you go home.
Right.
That's your friends. You might, and the old quote about get a dog if you want a friend in Washington. Yeah, Trump didn't realize that. I mean, which is amazing because he does seem to realize an awful lot that other people don't get.
Right.
But I
And then
think when go ahead.
Well, no, and then you saw him kind of churning through cabinet members because he was starting to come to the realization that, I'm thinking of it became a meme online, that first
Yeah.
meeting post-election in 2016 where he had his first briefing, with Obama and the White House staff for the transition, which is a normal, and everybody was like, making jokes about it, but you kind of saw on his face, like he was kind of like, he's much stiffer than he normally is. Like he wasn't as jolly and kind of jovial, of
Yeah.
making jokes. He was kind of like he just got his first White House briefing about, like, okay, this is the job, and he kind of you can kind of see it on his face, like, why the fuck did I do this? Like this is crazy. Why would I do this? But here he is. Yeah. So
Is it that the big question when you
yeah,
think about like, I've joked with people. I think the only way I'm becoming a multimillionaire is winning the Powerball or something. But
yes,
when it's huge, someone asks like, "What would you do?" Well, I have to tell you, you wouldn't see me.
yeah,
I'd be gone.
yes,
I mean,
exactly. Yeah,
I would not be out there like he is. You've
right.
got the money. I mean, he likes it. I get that. I don't think I would. I think I'd want to be more in hiding, to speak, where I'm living a private life. Not, you're not wasting your time,
Right.
serving, but for
A lot of
all the hits you
headaches.
take,
Yeah.
yeah. And you start, no matter who you are, you're going to start with half the people not only not voting for you, but disliking you to the point where, anything can be said. You see that with Trump now, and maybe you're and Burr didn't have this problem, but
Right.
whether it's the Epstein files, well, he's a pedophile. You'll see
Right.
stuff online, where they put fake photos. He's sleeping with, I don't know,
Oh
little
yeah.
girls, and
Yep.
it's like, and they say anything, and I often wonder, like, you should sue these people. I mean, just sue them.
And
I don't care if they're
not only do they say anything, sometimes what people said online is used as a source and not in a journalist piece about it,
oh yeah.
So that's really the real deterioration of that, the sources and kind of, because it'll be like, oh, well, some crazy person online said this, and then all of a sudden it's showing up in the New York Times as like a cited thing of like, this is what people believe. I'm like, well, how many people believe that, But also, I was thinking of like you made this comparison, yeah, with the indictments. I was thinking, the big thing in the indictments, the people that were saying that they're unfair, blah blah, they were focusing kind of on the wrong thing, right? Maybe because there wasn't all that much there. Is probably like,
Mhm.
they were focusing on the hush money for Stormy Daniels. They were focusing on they were trying to get him on these kind of weird technicalities that most politicians don't ever get, caught on, and to call it treason or fraud.
Mhm.
That one with his real estate properties, was that the DC one or was that the New York one with
That was New York. That
they
was,
were
yeah.
claiming, very, very like kind of shaky claims about how to lie, about the value of the property. So, well, he wasn't, and when you look into it, it's like, well, he wasn't really doing anything that most people don't do already when they're talking about selling real estate, like it's like, is that illegal? Is that illegal enough to try to convict a former president?
Well, right,
James,
and
yeah,
you're hitting on a major point. Like, it's a former president, which,
right,
this idea, like, well, the law applies to everyone. Yes, but at the same time, we also have, a country to protect. We don't go charging our former presidents,
right,
because everybody would do that, because it goes back and forth. A Democrat's in there, then a
right,
Republican. You might get a couple terms. You might even get, you had Reagan Bush for 12 years, but then it switches back. You get
right.
Clinton for 8 years. It's, so with that in mind, do you want to be the guy charging the other party, because they're going to come after you? And, some of these guys are young enough where they're going to be around, or certainly their staff members are. And, we charge, like with the, Trump cases, in New York, you had the Stormy Daniels, the so-called hush money one.
Right. Yeah.
It's really, okay, you labeled it a legal expense. Well, did you pay taxes? I mean, you didn't take a deduction you weren't entitled to,
Right.
because they would have charged you with that. So I
Right.
think we know that. So it's really just what you put on a document. And then the same thing on their other case with the Deutsche Bank,
Right.
which testified, and I did a lot of real estate as an attorney. There is no bank, that takes your word for it.
Right.
There, they do appraisals. They rely on their own. The Deutsche Bank vice president said, no, we don't listen to him,
Right.
or anybody. We do our own due diligence. And if they think they can make money off of you, which they made a lot of money off of Donald Trump,
Right. Yeah.
they're going to do business with him.
Yeah.
And so those cases seem very weak to charge anyone with, especially, the one document when you had to bring in I guess it's the federal election, although they never said what makes it a felony. They said it could be one of three things. And like, well, don't you think the defendant's owed at least an explanation on
Right.
what he's being charged with? I mean, just that you put something in the ledger that's incorrect, it's really a payoff to a porn star to hide an affair, I guess. But it really is kind of a legal expense because she
Right.
is going to make trouble for you.
And there was an NDA involved. Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems kind of it's weak, to convict on. It's weak to find anybody, even in the fraud case with the Deutsche Bank. Okay, you're finding civil liability, but he didn't really defraud anyone, and they didn't rely. I mean, you don't
Right.
rely at all, and they use a New York statute that says we don't care. New York has a lot of weird
Yeah.
legal legal interpretations, and
Left
it
over
really
from the
comes
Aaron
down.
Burr days. Yeah. Left over from the
Yeah, it's
Aaron
like,
Burr days. Yeah.
why do you go forward with those cases? And prosecutors, certainly the U.S. prosecutors, could probably charge us all with something. If they dig deep enough, they can combine something to make it a case. And certainly if you're high profile, but we can't have a system like that. And I
Yeah.
think you see that in the Aaron Burr days, where there's some evidence that not only Jefferson's allies but Jefferson himself was deeply involved in the case. And with Trump, there's well, certainly Trump made the allegation that it's Biden, but I think what he's saying is it's the Biden administration.
Right. The
It's
Biden
the attorney
DOJ,
general.
the
Yeah,
appointees. Yeah.
right. You've got the attorney general saying do this. Merrick Garland, who
Right.
it's very political for a guy that was going to be a Supreme Court justice, if not
Yeah.
for McConnell. And you look at that and you think this is a former president and now current president, but at that time, and do you go that far to ruin a man? And I'd say the answer is yes, they did try to do that.
Right.
No, it backfired.
Yeah.
And that's where you see one of the contrasts with, and maybe it's the sign we live in, like the times of social media, Trump being a personality on his own. I make the case in the book where Burr just relied on the legal. He looked at it and said, they can't convict me on this, and I know the law. And Trump looked at it like they will convict me on this. I don't care because they hate me, but I'm going to go in front of the cameras and bring it to the jury of the voters and rely on my own personality and whatever. And I think, Trump's way worked.
Yeah, there's a writer I like. I'm gonna butcher his name here. I think it's James Kirchick or something. He writes for the Airmail now, but he's written for a bunch of different publications. When this was happening, post the first Trump term, those are first early times of the Biden term there in 2020, he wrote a great piece and he got eviscerated for it. Went on talk shows to talk about it, like Bill Maher and stuff. He was going on these shows to talk about it. And he made this case where he just said, there's a reason that Ford pardoned Nixon. He's like, okay, and it has nothing to do with innocence or guilt. And he made this point about how if we're going to do
Mhm.
this, he's like, Ford knew this. He's like, if he was going to do this, it was going to tear the country apart and there were going to be political consequences for his own party, that he
Mhm.
unforeseen, consequences that could be catastrophic. And he was trying to just be, the best thing to do here is just pardon, move on, and it'll be in the history books, blah blah blah. And of course now we're relitigating everything about history now, so everything in history books is being relitigated now. But still, I just thought that was just such an interesting point that nobody was taking seriously at the time, where it's like actually there's a good
Mhm.
reason that we would pardon former presidents no matter what happened, because the consequences of pursuing this, if we're going to pursue this, if we're going to have, four different states, over 200 different indictments for some of them pretty fucking flimsy, with a lot of this stuff.
Mhm.
What are we doing here? What do we think's going to happen from this? Like, well, look at what happened. Well, the consequences for the Democrats were terrible, and then the consequences for the Republican Party were great. They got back into the majority, the slight majority that they have now in the houses. And it's just like, well, what did you think was going to happen from this? Like you're making a
Yeah.
stand, of course, but like at what cost? Like looking at these second order effects, third order effects, and very rarely do we have a politician that can do that, of course. And it's hard to do, period. But a politician who cares enough or is smart enough to think about, a couple steps ahead. McConnell might
Yeah.
be one of those, honestly. Who,
McConnell, yeah. I mean, I think when you look at that, and Ford's a good example because I think a lot of people were angry, but they didn't understand
right,
the historical, you know, reasons for doing it and going forward, what it meant for the country. You couldn't, Trump has made the point a few times about it wouldn't look right with Hillary Clinton in the
right,
first term.
exactly.
A lot of his people were yelling,
The
you
lock her
know,
up chant. And he
right.
was asked
And
about
he's
it in
like
every
that,
interview, and he kind of
right.
was like, not worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, and how would it look for the, former first lady to be
Right.
locked up? Assuming you could convict her. And we
Right.
don't,
And
it's easy to lock her up.
And he
You
was
got to
thinking,
convict
that would reflect poorly on him too. He was,
her.
I mean, not that he's, obviously he's not the less long-term thinker, but I mean, he was still thinking, that would stain his legacy too. They're already coming after him for everything else. Why would he
Right.
put another stain on his legacy that, oh, he's going after his opponents? Well, turns out, whatever,
Yeah.
that kind of got turned on him, but still, yeah.
It gives them an excuse though, like it's, well,
Right.
you did the same thing. And I think, you see that now with some of
Yeah.
the, James Comey, for instance, where people, on the Comey side, whatever that is, I'm not sure he's loved by anybody, but, 'cause the Democrats were mad at him too at some point. But, this idea Trump's coming after his enemies. And you're looking at it like, well, you kind of lost the ability to argue this when you filed 4 cases against Trump himself. And then, some of those civil cases, were those coordinated? I think they were. They were talking,
Yeah.
the attorneys on CNN for how long about suing them, and which is it's a problem if you go down that road. I think it worked out somewhat for Trump. I wouldn't want to go through those times in court, but he overcame that and was able to win. It's interesting. I don't. He just had the personality, and I think the
Right.
social media where you can bring it to the people directly. In Aaron Burr's time, you couldn't really do that.
Right.
By the time they get the news and their little pamphlet, it's 6 months later. We already thought you were killed for treason. What happened? So, there you don't have that immediate interest.
Right.
I'm going to credit CNN for the 24/7, although I'm not sure they're still good with that. But at one time that's who we went to, right? If
Yeah.
anything happened, you turned on CNN. You didn't go to your local stations. Now, obviously, cable, you've got MSNBC and Fox and News Nation and all these
Right.
other ones. But at one point it was, if you wanted news, you went to CNN.
And
That's changed.
yeah, a lot of those networks, they do basically party work. They do party work for the party that they, favor here, where they're, everyone wants an impartial news source. It's like, you don't really want an impartial news source. You want, the one that reaffirms and does party work for the one that, you agree with here. And that's people say it's one of the problems. But, I was thinking of, I'm a fan of the journalist, Matt Taibbi,
Oh
and,
yeah, yeah.
when he was testifying before Congress here over the Twitter files, which was, listeners that don't know, I think most are probably familiar with this, with just an overview, um, where it came out after Elon Musk bought Twitter, he called a few journalists in. One of them was Matt Taibbi, and he started giving them the correspondence history between basically the higher ups at Twitter, this company, social media company, and the Biden administration. Zuckerberg has gone on Rogan several times now, the biggest podcast in the world, and has said similar things that Facebook and Meta were getting these kind of same type of exchanges where it started to become very threatening eventually, threatening them with regulation. But I remember he was testifying, and Matt Taibbi was in the Congress, and they were asking him about indictments over this. And he just said at one point, kind of rolling his eyes, he's just like, indictments aren't charges. Okay. He's like, indictments are speculative things. He's like, they're not a guarantee that somebody's charged or guilty, about this. And if you're going to treat
Yeah.
indictments as evidence of guilt, well, then we're throwing out a huge principle of America, which is, innocent until proven guilty. It's harder in practice in reality than it is in, theory, of course. But, I mean, this is way out of left field. But even Charlie Manson was saying shit like this, when he's like, you had my face on the cover of Time magazine. I was guilty before the trial even started, and it's kind of true, right? Everybody kind of
Right.
already had their ideas of whatever, we don't need to defend that guy. But like, for
No.
politicians, it's a little, yeah, I don't, it's
Yeah.
just insane where we are.
Where do you get a fair trial? When it's hard now, I think, very difficult, especially for politicians.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had our share here in Illinois, for sure. I don't know if we lead the league, but we've got to be in the top three. And, when you see it, sometimes some of the people I know might be friends with someone being indicted. And I always think, they hear, well, he's going to fight this. He thinks he has a chance. And I'm like, you don't have a chance.
Right.
You've got like a 90% chance of losing in federal court. Your best bet is to make a deal because it's over for you and you're going away. It's just how long. And I think that's the problem. And you look at it's amazing. I think in both cases, looking at this, even back then, charging Burr with treason.
Right.
There might have been another charge at the time, but there certainly wasn't. It wasn't treason.
Right.
And you can't get if you don't have the elements of treason, my advice would be do not charge the guy.
Right.
And with Trump, same thing, kind of flimsy cases. If you have a case, use it. That said, when he said he was going to run and, the primaries were starting, you had some interest there. I thought they're probably going to be successful in stopping him, that
Right.
it is going to work. I wouldn't do it myself, nor do I think it's something anybody should do. But I thought this might work. You've got an awful lot of people against Trump.
Right.
But as it unwrapped, as it went through the time, these cases were so flimsy. I think the American public, whether it's they're listening to their news source or, social media and sharing things, whatever the reason, I think the people obviously decided, hey, wait a minute, this is not great. Now, certainly some of those events during his campaign, like Butler, where the assassination attempt, certainly helped, where people may have said, I don't care. I don't know. I think it was Musk who said, once he saw that, or maybe it was Zuckerberg, one of them said, once they saw that, they were on board. That, so maybe it didn't matter how the cases were going. It more was about, wait a minute, this guy is either nuts or he really is fighting for us and I want to be part of it. And, you saw Musk with him then all the time.
Right.
And Zuckerberg at least joined forces behind the scenes.
It's a little subtler than Musk was. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he might have been playing both sides. I'm not sure, but
which is a smart thing to do if you run one of the biggest market caps in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm surprised any of these guys get that involved. I mean, the way Musk is on stage, and it's like, wow. I mean, I think he made a big difference. Guys like that, guys like, when you have
even
Robert Kennedy.
Joe Rogan, I think,
Joe
ended up
Rogan
endorsing Trump a week before or whatever, after he had him on, his show a week before the election there.
Well,
He's
and that
huge.
kind of shows,
yeah.
It shows the value of the media. In the book, I talk about how the media has changed over the years. It's certainly not what I learned in school. I think most people, whether they're involved, maybe the people involved won't admit it because you never want to admit, that you're doing it yourself. But they train these students now to be advocates. It's not about, doing it down the middle.
Right.
If I was doing it for a living, as an actual journalist, I don't think I'd register either way to vote in primaries, just so nobody questions me. I don't think you shouldn't know how I'm voting. Maybe I'd be the Johnny Carson of journalists, but I I would want to play it down the middle so people go, yeah, that guy doesn't have a bias. If they know that you're, out there as a, journalist and you're pushing to one side, it takes away from your voice.
Yeah.
I think, you see now so many other sources have popped up. We had those, 5 newspapers, the 4 majors, and then the, more of a suburban paper when I was growing up that we talked about. Now we're down to 2 really, and they're not very good.
Right.
and you can tell what side they're on, which is bad.
Right.
But what makes up for that is you have a lot of podcasters. You have, other, networks. You don't have to rely. If you don't like CNN, you can turn on Fox. If you
Right.
don't like Fox, now I'm not sure. I wish there was something, and I think CNN probably should have been the one to do it, where you have both sides.
Right.
Where I always thought, like on Fox, the best show they used to have, I thought, was when it was Hannity and Combs. They had the conservative and the liberal, and they kind of battled it out on issues.
So that was before my time. Yeah. That's how
It
long
was
ago.
it was a good show. Then Combs left, I think, to do a radio show or something, and then it's the Hannity show instead. So you don't get that pushback. And CNN had different crossfire and all these things. Some of that gets out of hand. I get it.
Yeah.
They're using talking points from the NRC, the DNC or RNC, and like to avoid that. But it would be better for the viewers to at least have different views in there, and I think they'd learn more. But maybe the viewers don't want that, to your
I
point.
was going to say the days of William F. Buckley are debating on TV are gone. Yeah, the days of the
Right.
conservative versus liberal every week on TV that everybody was tuning into and was interested in, and those are long gone. Yeah, those the
Do
firing
you
line.
remember the McLaughlin report?
No.
He would have John McLaughlin would have, I'd say 5, maybe 4 or 5 guests on. Clarence Page was there. He had different, he'd have a couple conservatives. Mort Kondracki was one of them. So major, writers usually, and they would kind of debate the issues. You got both viewpoints. In the end, McLaughlin would say wrong. He would kind of decide, but really the viewers were deciding.
Right.
What do you think, Eleanor? And then he'd say wrong, and you're like, okay, that's. I don't know if you're right or wrong. There, you think it's wrong, but it was good TV.
I was even, just my YouTube algorithm just a week or 2 ago, it got suggested to me and I watched the whole, 30-minute segment. It was the Dick Cavett show.
Oh.
And he had Gore Vidal versus Norman Mailer basically on there talking about, this is after Norman Mailer's kind of book on, anti-feminist kind of book that came out. And, I was just thinking, I was like, can you imagine Jimmy Fallon like having those like 2 giants on to debate something? Like, you imagine that? Like, no, it doesn't happen. Like that doesn't happen anymore, where these guys are going at it back and forth. And it's actually quite entertaining. They were both funny guys. They're both making jokes at the other's expense or whatever. It was just, we're in a different time here. So talking about the media, that gets me to this other question I have here. It's just like, the media attacks, I wanted to ask you, and this is just opinion, but how much would you say the media influences public opinion? Because this is always the debate right now, right? Like, how much does the media matter? How much do quote unquote influencers matter now in the social media age? And you were talking about how the media was very important. It's in your book, between the Burr and the Trump kind of indictments as they were put on trial here for treason and other various things. I don't know. I mean, how important is media in this regard?
I think it used to be very important, but now when you look at the percentage of people that actually trust the media, I think we have to come to the conclusion they're not that important anymore. It used to be, even in local politics, if a reporter called you, you answered the call, you responded, you didn't. Now I would advise people, blow them off. You
Right.
know what they're asking,
Right.
and you don't want to answer it, and they're going to print, and I noticed it locally. just being in the very local politics, helping candidates, and then running myself. It's kind of a funny story, but sad to me. There was a newspaper columnist for the local suburban paper who would write his story and then call to get his quote, which may be more common than I would like it to be. And then he'd talk to you enough to get a quote that he wanted,
Right.
Or what he said as a quote. And one time, I was involved in an election. He said, he wrote something and he puts it in the paper, and I'm mad. I pick up the phone, I call him, and I said, "You argued the direct opposite, 2 years ago." And he said, "I did?" I said, "Yes." He goes, "Well, I wish I could check that, but our system here, it's hard to do that." I'm like, "Don't worry, I have it." I mean, I had saved it, and he still didn't care. He wasn't going to retract it.
Right.
It didn't matter because it was for, in the case that involved me, it was more he was trying to help someone else. In the other one, it was helping his guy. It's like, so you're changing your opinion, based on who the person is.
Right.
And that's the sad part about it. I think the funny part is he couldn't retrieve it. He was like,
Right.
how can you not retrieve your own stuff? Or save it somewhere. I thought I lost a lot of faith in that guy.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's it's a problem when you look at the media. I mean, there's probably some influence, but you're, like you said, you're going to your source.
Right.
If I know people that used to be big New York Times readers, and as time has gone on, they've gone away from it.
I'm one of them. Yeah.
They don't trust it anymore.
Right. Yeah.
And they find their news elsewhere.
And it's just boring. It's almost predictable. Like for somebody like me that kind of enjoys the intellectual arguments from pretty much both sides. I'm like, if you make a good argument, I'm interested, to hear it. But like it just became almost predictable. Even like I said, there's only a few columns, like a handful of columnists, and they tend to happen to be the center right columnists that are very few. On the Times, like I love Do Thought stuff. I think his stuff is very thoughtful and very interesting. He's making arguments in that paper that you're not going to see from anybody else. He's making these kind of interesting arguments. His podcast even I thought has been pretty interesting too. The way he approaches it, very open, very open-minded, giving everybody a fair shake here. But yeah, that's interesting how the media plays into this with this. I'm just curious because I think obviously the media has a huge influence, but I feel like we're in this kind of stuck time warp where we're talking about Fox, we're talking about CNN. Those viewerships are lower than they've ever been. Like most people are getting their news through YouTube commentators, people that have no journalistic background or anything, and they don't give a shit about being fair, or impartial. And most people that's getting more views than anything on Fox or CNN or, any of the news, even the, people, News Nation, these kind of newer, more right-wing ones. Like, how big is their viewership even? I mean, I think it's mostly these independent kind of social media things. And when you say that, I think there's this tendency, especially, if you're on the other side of it. So if I'm arguing for the Republicans, the Democrats would be on the other side of it and vice versa, they would be, oh, well, it doesn't influence that much. It's not that much of an influence. I'm like, I don't know. Companies are paying hundreds of millions of dollars for influencers to sell their products. I mean, why do you think that the politics is doing anything less? And then you're seeing this stuff come out now. They are doing it. They're paying these influencers, high 5 figures, low 6 figures to make posts in favor of their candidate to, even if they're not true, even if they're, some type of slander or whatever, it's not, nobody cares about the impartial angle. That's kind of like a dying, an old generation thing. The older generation cared about that, but now it's just out the window. It's just out the window. You can become a journalist at the most prestigious publications in the world. Your name on the masthead, it's the highest perch in journalism to work at the New York Times or something. And you can just fabricate things if you want. I mean, it's reached a point of very absurdity as long as it kind of plays for the right team. You can fabricate stuff and it goes through the fact checking process, which is pretty rigorous. Like, I mean, I'm not naive about, how what it is to publish a column in something like the New York Times. They're not going to let just anybody do that. And, they're going to put you
Right.
through the ringer. Where did you get this? Where did you get this? I can't find this. They need their shit. They want to do a serious job. But then everything's so clustered now, stuff sleeping through the cracks. And then I think it goes to these kind of indictments too, where like these kind of indictments are media based. They were based on a lot of hearsay. They were based on a lot of, and then people were so overzealous to, get him, like, oh, we're gonna get him on this. They were cutting corners, they were missing details, and it's like, well, how bad did you actually want to get him? Because you're missing the kind of, dotting the T's and crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So you're missing something. Well, then your case falls apart because you were just so overzealous and partisan about it that you couldn't see, the forest from the trees here. And look what happens now. I mean, what did you think was going to happen when you're approaching it that way? It just, so I'm just fascinated by this. And then you drawing the comparison all the way back to the Aaron Burr days, I was just very
Yeah.
curious about how you thought that played in with media and stuff, getting smear pieces written on you. I've had a former political consultant on. He wrote a few kind of political thriller fiction books. But I was asking him, he ran for office in his local area in Pennsylvania there a few times, and he had, these articles with friends that he had worked with, colleagues that were lying about him in papers, and he'd have to read them, while he's running for office. And I just asked him about what that's like, and he's just like, I mean, it's devastating. I mean, you thought this person was your friend, and then they're giving a quote to this journalist about how I'm a piece
Yeah.
of shit. It's pretty hard to
Well,
deal with.
and that's bad, but then you also have the anonymous,
Yes.
sources.
Yes.
And now, it used to be, you couldn't go with one anonymous source.
Right.
You needed to back that up. And then it becomes, and I think Watergate was one of those where you had Woodward and Bernstein and, Ben Bradley telling them, no, you need to get someone to say this is true. There's another
Right.
source behind this. Now they don't necessarily have to come out, but you
Right.
need to have that source, and I need to know it. That's gone.
Yeah.
Now it's someone told someone who wrote something, and you're like, wait a minute, that's not. How do I battle against that if I'm Donald Trump or if I'm bring your accuser forward. I have a right. In court you'd have that right. Now I want that right as a politician, and maybe it's libel laws, the protection with Sullivan, New York Times cases. Yes, you probably needed something for people that make honest mistakes, but it's stretched so far now that
Right.
you could make it up. And I
Right.
do believe there are journalists who have made it up, or they've relied on made up information. The Russian collusion stuff. It's made up.
Yeah.
you know, it's really a hoax, as Trump says, and you're sitting there going, how did the New York Times report it? And then everybody else reports based on, hey,
Yes.
it's the New York Times.
Right.
The New York Times is reporting. So, okay, I can write the New York Times is reporting and do the story again. And you do that throughout the country, and pretty soon it's like everybody believes there's still a big percentage, according to polls, of voters, or at least
Right.
American citizens,
Yeah.
who believe that Russia helped Trump. It's like, what? I mean, it's been blown apart, but they say the original story so many times. The little, retraction, or the story that says, oh, never mind, nobody cares. We've moved on. We're on the next term, or
Yeah.
we're beyond that.
So
So,
that was what Matt Taibbi he was the one that broke that hoax case where
yeah,
he testified before Congress about it, all of that, which was just go and watch those, listeners. You want to see how bad faith does. I mean, those are all show trials anyway, whatever, testifying before a House
yeah,
committee or something. But
yeah.
he was saying that, like he said, when he found the dossier, that everything was based on the Steele dossier for that, he said he started trying to verify it, as a normal journalist would, right? To verify where it
Mhm.
came from. And he said when he started calling these numbers to verify it, he realized that, like, none of it was verified. He said it was me and then one journalist in like Canada, that like the only people in the fucking world that made a call to verify this information and realized that it was false. Like it wasn't verified and it was run by everybody. And I think that is like people deny this influence. They deny the power that they have when you're a kind of syndicated columnist, or a columnist at a big paper with a large, syndication. It's they deny that that influences everything. Like you said, it's that kind of domino effect where the big trustworthy, well, the New York Times wrote it, so it must be fact checked, and
Mhm.
all of that, and then everybody just runs with it. Then there's some social media influence. I mean, you could say something. You see it whenever there's a scandal or an assassination attempt or something. There's a bunch of stuff that just is made up and just starts going over the waves of social media
Oh yeah.
for miles and miles and miles all over the world. And then when the time the retraction or the correction comes in, it's never going to reach that. It's going to be a fraction of what the big reach was for, the lie. And that's a
Yeah.
problem, obviously. But somebody like Trump has interestingly kind of uses that to his advantage in a certain way, where he kind of understands the social media stuff more than a lot of other politicians do, which is just interesting how he because he's getting all this press that's obviously negative for the most part, and somehow manages to spin it on his stuff. Somehow manages
Yeah.
to use that negative press to his advantage, and it's kind of like one of his major skill that most politicians don't have. Is this guy is literally, they call him Teflon Don. Like it literally nothing. He just moves on and spins the media and keeps on, chugging along.
Well, I think, part of that too is I think he realizes in this term, and maybe he picked it
Right,
up at the end of last term, that they're not your friend
right,
and they're not there to help you. They're there to take you down, which I don't know. I think journalism in some ways with Watergate, a lot of people were entering journalism maybe for the wrong reason.
right,
You no longer had the gumshoe guys with the hats and the pencil in their ears
right.
and the notebook. They were there to make money, to be stars,
Sell
which
books. Yeah,
yeah, and it becomes a problem on the actual reporting, where Woodward and Bernstein did very well after Watergate,
yeah,
but anybody know them beforehand?
right.
I'm going to guess a very small percentage.
They were local
You know,
reporters, yeah, in
yeah,
DC, yeah,
making a living,
right,
but nothing, they weren't stars. All of a sudden, we're doing, we got books, we got movies, they're on talk shows, they are stars. And if you're sitting there as a young journalism student, or maybe you're in the journalism field already, you're thinking, well, I could do that. So from that time, we've had a lot of this anti-president, like everybody's, you go right away to Ford and you mention the pardon. I can't tell you how many people would think what he got something for it. There was a deal.
right,
Well, Nixon was forced out because he didn't have the Republican Party backing him anymore. They were going to vote to impeach,
right,
and he was going to be convicted. And he was told that by Republican leaders in the House and the Senate. You step down, or you will be convicted of it. And that's the only thing that made him move. I
right,
don't think it's like, well, I've got to get my vice president to make a deal with me. He was just a beneficiary of Ford, maybe putting the country ahead of his own self-interest, because
right,
when he did that, what did it lead to? Jimmy Carter saying, well, we need honesty and we need, and appealing to people on that basis that, whether you're qualified or not, you
right,
seem like an honest guy. And he probably was an honest guy,
yeah,
but I don't know that Ford was a dishonest guy. He just thought the best thing was like, let's move on. It's best for the country. And maybe he didn't explain it very well. um,
no,
but he said that stuff. I don't know. Maybe we didn't listen.
right,
As voters, we thought, there's a deal, because we want to find the deal. I'm kind of sickened by, obviously Charlie Kirk
right.
being assassinated, and seeing that, and you couldn't help but see it.
Oh, it was everywhere.
That's
Yeah,
right. And you see the blood, and the thing that strikes me is, it kind of reminds me of like Kennedy being killed, I was young,
Right.
so I didn't know it then, but I've seen that thousands of times,
Right.
right? And everybody has, but the people who I really feel bad for are, John F. Kennedy's children
Right.
who grew up. If I saw it thousands of times, they probably saw it hundreds of thousands of times. And that's, you're just little kids. So your memories of your dad is the bullet hitting them in the head in the car. And the same thing with Charlie Kirk's kids. They're small, and that's going to be the memory of their dad. They're too young to really remember him otherwise. And it's so sad. But then the worst, I guess there's no part that's worse than that, but to add on to it, to make it even a more terrible story are the people posting on social media. And some are allies or say they were allies of Charlie Kirk, writing about all these conspiracy theories of which they have not one bit of evidence. I mean, they are as
Right.
bad. If you hate journalists on, a certain newspaper, you have to hate these people just as much. The people that Elon Musk says we are the news,
Right.
yes, and some of them aren't doing any better than the old news. They're
Yes.
doing, my God, how do you have no conscience that you're on there just going for clicks? I guess it's the brand now is to be a nut, right? I
Right.
mean, you can build up a conspiracy group that wants to find something wrong with everything. That it's not a guy on the roof. It came from the different direction. It's the Israelis. It's
Right.
something blew up in his neck. It's like, I saw it.
Yeah.
Quit spreading this cockamamie. That's an interesting word. You don't get to use it much, but it's so ridiculous that you come up with these conspiracy theories and people are reading that. And I assume some are agreeing because I see, I'm going down that rabbit hole. I'm reading
Yeah.
comments and I'm thinking, I just feel bad for, his kids, his wife, his parents, anybody that really knew him. I mean, I only knew him from the little clips on social media and, his podcast. I
Right.
saw some of that. And I thought, interesting guy because he accomplished so much,
Yeah.
before most of us have even decided what we're doing with our lives, right? It's like, what am I going to do? I don't know. You get people, that spend 6 or 7 years in college and they're like, I don't know. Then they get out and do something totally different.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
so this guy seemed to know what he was going to do at an early age. Now his memory is, all these theories. It's like,
Yeah.
no, we have a mentally disturbed person shooting him
Right.
and killing him. Let's not make it into, the Israelis are doing it. And,
Yeah.
especially if you have no proof. If you have proof, bring it forward. I'll read
Yeah.
it. It's I know that's going off on a tangent. I told you I might do
Yeah.
that, but that's one of them.
Well, I mean, that's part of the media landscape now is this elevation of conspiracy to, hard-hitting journalism, basically. Like they kind of elevate conspiracy as if it isn't conspiracy, that it's fact-finding or something. And you see this often with everything that's going down. Yeah, it is kind of a, how do you deal with that? And none of us, I mean, nobody really knows how to deal with that yet. We're still trying to figure it out I'm thinking of, Joe Rogan had Bill Murray on his podcast, and he was asking him about the book that uh, Woodward wrote on John Belushi. And it
Mhm.
was Bill Murray just said he couldn't even read that book. And he said, why? Joe Rogan's like, why? He said, well, he's like, he was a friend of mine. I knew John Belushi. He's like, we hung out together. He did drugs together. We did all this stuff. Like, he said, I got 6 pages into that. And right in the 6 pages, he said, I thought to myself, oh my God, they framed Nixon. Like, because he said, because when he was reading about his friend that he knew personally, spent time with all the time, he said everything that was written in those first 6 pages was untrue. Like, he's
Yeah,
like, and he's like,
I
that's not what happened. And he's like, I'm thinking, oh my God, how much of this guy's career is just about like kind of misconstruing what happened and putting it into his books and making all this money. Like, oh my
yeah.
God.
I remember that now that you bring it up. And
Yeah,
Bill
the clip
Murray,
went viral all over
yeah,
yeah.
and he has a great way of saying anything. I laugh at things he says that are probably even serious,
Right.
but it's just his delivery. But yes, that's it. The point, the underlying point of that is often we don't know, not to sound like Dick Cheney, but we don't know until we know, and then the unknowns, and because when it happens to you or someone and you're reading the story, and that probably goes to Trump, when this idea when he went to Washington, he thought it was like, oh, they're my friends. I
Right.
I know all these guys. I've given them campaign donations. I've been to their parties. They love me. And then when he gets there, it's like, oh, they hate me. What's going on? You don't know until you find out for real where you stand. And with reporters, sometimes you think the media, oh, they're fair. They're giving me a fair shot. They called me and they write something about you. It's like, holy cow.
Yeah.
How do they? I had I had done some work as an attorney and I'd been involved in a campaign and donated, some money to it. And they made a big deal of, some report was not filed. It was filed on the sixth day instead of the fifth day. They wanted to come after me, and they did. But the news columnist in the suburban paper, wrote his column saying he started it out with Dennis Brennan, the attorney for the school district, could be indicted on federal charges. I'm in Vegas at the time, on vacation, my wife, and one of my brothers calls and says, "Hey, dude, did you see the newspaper? You're all over it." I'm like, "What?" Um, and he starts reading it to me. I'm like, "What? What federal crime?" No matter whether it was filed on time or not, there's no way it's a federal crime. It's a state election. There's nothing. I sued the guy, and his excuse was, and they won on the defamation, that it's an opinion,
Right.
and it made case law in Illinois. And I ran into the attorney years later, who was on the other side, and he said, "You're the famous Dennis Brennan." I thought, how? I thought he was going to talk about some case. He was going to talk about my case. And he said, "You made great libel law for us defense attorneys. It was new law." And we fought it. We kept appealing because, what do you mean it's your opinion? You made it up. That's not journalism.
Yeah.
It's my opinion. What? And, they claimed he had a right to have an opinion, but he didn't write it as it's my opinion, or it's like his sources told him that I could be. That doesn't sound like an opinion. That sounds like someone told you that they were investigating me. They never were. There was no investigation. It's like you totally made it up to make your story, which did damage to the people I was supporting. It certainly did damage to me. There were a lot of people looking as if I was a criminal. And I thought, wow, you can't believe it when you read something about someone else now. Remember that you're, it's not just you they go after.
Yeah.
And I think to Bill Murray's point, it's like when you know the facts and you know what's going on, you're like, wait a minute. Now that they framed Nixon, it's funny.
Yeah.
But I get where you're going with it. And I think I'd make it more personal as something about me, but they framed Nixon. It's much funnier.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of, I'm a fan of Michael Crichton, the writer, and he gave this interview back, when he was still alive in the early 2000s, I think. He was talking about reading newspapers. He talked about what they call the Gell-Mann amnesia effect. And he was explaining it to the guy interviewing him, where he's like, okay, you pick up the paper in the morning. He's like, and every once in a while you'll come across, an article on a subject that really well, like it's your profession. So he's like, particle physics, or he's like, he's like, in my experience, show business, he's like, I knew a lot about show business. I was very successful in it. He's like, so I'd read an article about show business or something. He's like, and you're like, this is completely wrong. He's like, not only is it so wrong that you find out that the journalist actually got cause and effect backwards because they're just so ignorant about what's going on in this. He's like, and you're reading it, you're like, oh my God, this is awful. He's like, and then you turn the page and you read the next article as if it's not like that, as if it was perfectly valid, right? It's this, they call
That's
it
a
the
good point.
Gell-Mann amnesia effect, where you just kind of are like, what? This is ridiculous. How could you ever do this? Turn the page, the next article, you're like, oh, well, this is fair. This is fact
Yeah, I
founded.
don't
And
know anything about it, so it must be fair.
exactly.
What I
Yeah. Yeah.
know, and that, yeah, it's true. I think, now I think I've become better at that, where you now know when they write about you, or your friends, or people, and they can ruin careers.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they were trying to do with Trump. I think even with Burr, he had the party press era, so which we're not far. I think we're doing the same thing
Yeah.
really with our outlets. And you want a conservative newspaper, you go to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post. You want a liberal paper, you pretty much go everywhere else.
Right. Yes.
you know, and that's what it becomes. And you know, it, so people go to that source for the news, but that's what they think the news is.
Right.
And back then, you had the party press era where the parties were supporting these pamphlets and newspapers, and they were putting the news that they wanted out there. You couldn't. I mean, I think there's always been that overriding idea in
Right.
editorials, where like the Tribune used to be. Colonel McCormick owned the Tribune, and he endorsed Republicans,
Right.
and that was the way it was. And the Sun Times was the Democrat paper, the working paper,
Right.
and so growing up in our household, the Sun Times was the word. But I was becoming a conservative in my own mind. But
Right.
for my dad, that was the Democrat paper. The that isn't those were the editorials though.
Right.
I don't know that it was. I didn't realize at that time that it was leaking into the reporting.
Right.
The straight news story is supposed to be the news story. Now I pick up, I get the Tribune delivered for some reason, and I read, and you don't get the five W's and the one H anymore, where they're supposed to put that in the story. You're supposed to make it your lead, try to work as much as you can in there. Now it starts out with the reporter's opinion,
Right.
and it's like, I don't care about your opinion. I want to know what happened. Often you don't find out what really happened until you turn the page
Yeah.
and you pick up the continued story, and you're like, oh, the guy pulled a gun on the police officer. That's why he was shot.
Right. Yeah.
Because you read the other stuff about how the police officer was being investigated. He was shot. They have so many other shootings. This guy has, he's been before a review board. It's like, okay, that's all fine. But how about the story? In this case, the assailant, the dead guy now,
Yeah.
pulled his gun. Big mistake. The police officer or several of them shot him. It's like, well,
Right. Yeah.
that's what I would expect. I mean, I tend not to pull the gun on the police officer or anybody
Right.
that's shooting you.
I know Fran Lebowitz said this years ago, where she was talking about this was in the early 2000s too, during the Iraq War stuff, where she said, back when I was growing up, she's like, I could get a news story and it would be the news. It would be literally, this is what happened, this happened, and then this is what happened. She's like, now you pull up the news and it's kind of she was commentating on how like kind of creative nonfiction has kind of infiltrated journalism, where she's like, every piece you read is like on a rocky road in Afghanistan, like this kind of like literary style. They're trying to get the Pulitzer Prize for journalism or something. And it just kind of bogs down the piece, and you have to read, now it's 20 pages instead of 10 like it used to be. And you're just kind of clouding out all the information to do these kind of flourishes on the writing side of things. But I wanted to
Well,
ask you about this. No, please go on, please go on.
Well, I think just on that point, it probably connects to how you were talking about influencers. We all have this, 15 seconds or whatever the number is,
Yeah.
where they're doing these clips, and you get, that's what you get. It's like, okay, next one, next one. We're a newspaper story. I'm turning the page. I'm still reading this thing. Some of them, they'll go on for like 3 pages. I was like, who's reading this?
Yeah.
Who went 3 pages in the Tribune or the New York Times or what? Probably not many people, but everybody saw that, little clip on X or on Facebook or TikTok. And that's why these guys, I guess I know the DNC is paying some guys. I've seen it on X. And I don't know if the Republicans are, but if they are, I'm not surprised.
Right. It's safe to assume. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. It really is. It's the party press era of our own. It's and I'm not sure that's what Elon meant with "We Are the News."
Right.
I mean, but that's maybe what it's becoming.
Yeah. Well, that gets to the next question here. I wanted to ask you. Yeah. Is the media as an institution, is it a corrupt institution, you think?
I think it is. Yes. Unfortunately, and you have a lot of this in the book. I talk about all the people that go from government and the journalism, and even vice versa. Not only as reporters, George Stephanopoulos, everybody knows him, right? And he presents himself as a journalist. He's not.
Right.
Chuck Todd not only wasn't a journalist, he didn't graduate from college. So
Right.
how are you now sitting on this prestigious show, or was,
Right.
and telling us what is and isn't true? I'm not sure you've been trained to do that, either one of them. They've been trained to help in politics, and they were good at that.
Right.
But when we're mixing them, and we have people, leaving administrations, going to run networks, working in top spots there, not only as it used to be, you just came on,
Right.
and you gave your side of the story, and then we had the other party do the same thing. Now they're the experts,
Right.
for whatever network you're watching, and it's a problem. I mean, I think you lose credibility, and you corrupt yourselves, and they have no one to blame but themselves. They wanted media stars rather than journalists, and
Yeah.
I don't know that people. I haven't looked at any research, even if this has been done. Do people tune in to watch George Stephanopoulos on ABC, or are they turning in for the news on Sunday morning?
Right.
I would think they want to see a discussion, and George means nothing to them. If you
Right.
replace them with a real journalist, I don't know who that would be. Matt, you could put Matt Talabi in.
Yeah.
I mean, we're running out of guys, but if you want to find someone who is down the middle, that might be a good show. It's
Yeah.
it now has gone. Talk about it in the book again about the media. We see it in newspapers where it's slanted.
Yeah.
Bill O'Reilly used to have the No Spin Zone on Fox. You could argue whether there was spin or not, but
Right. Yeah.
it was a cute name, and I think it played to the thinking that people were spinning the news.
Right.
He was saying that in a way, maybe while spinning the news, but he was onto it. And I think when you're viewing that, you're going in with the idea of either I'm going to watch my network or read my paper, or I don't like what this guy's saying on social media. I'm just going to swipe that off.
Yeah.
But you see the whole system being corrupted, where the viewers or the readers they rely on that for the truth, but they're getting bad information. And to that point, I find myself now being the so-called fact checker, and I hate that. I hate the whole how newspapers would do the fact checking.
Yeah.
You're checking yourselves. That's not good.
Yeah.
But you read something, you're like, that can't be true. And a lot of it's on social media.
Yeah.
Facebook's notorious. People
Yeah.
point, the stuff that's on there. It's not a story. It's someone taking a quote and saying, there was one about Trump actually, where they claimed his mother had said these terrible things about him. And I thought that can't be true.
Yeah.
I would have read somewhere that his mother said this about him. Maybe it's his niece. Maybe it's possible, but someone said it. I'm looking it up. No one ever said it.
Right.
Talking about his lack of intelligence. And I'm like, this is totally made up. But half the people will read it, not see that it's not cited to anybody or a link to something. Like, you're going to put something on there? I want to see it. I don't trust anybody. I want to see it. I end up having to look it up myself, which we've become the fact checkers more than the news. I think
Yeah.
Elon, yeah, the first part right, where they were, maybe partially news, mostly fact checking. You can't trust it until you actually look into it. And sometimes there's some part of it that's true, but then when you read it, you're like, well, they missed the rest of the story.
Right.
There's a quote, but it goes on to, they did a lot of that with Charlie Kirk.
Yeah.
It's very interesting how they've, said, well, he's a racist because here's what he said.
Right.
And then you go and watch the whole clip and it's like, well,
Right.
it's in a bigger context. I don't believe he's a racist when you watch that. It's,
And there was that whole scandal at the Post. That one columnist was fired, and she's now suing the Post, I think, for wrongful termination. But it was the reason that it was because she fabricated a quote. I mean, and I think if we're going to be generous to somebody like that, maybe she did just set out to fabricate a quote. But I think it was more like, it was probably uh, put through all these filters. It was mashed up and remixed until it got to her social media feed, and she read it, took it as fact, and ran with it, after it's been mashed
yeah,
through all these different things. So it got to her almost second, third hand. She didn't
yeah,
verify it on her own. And that, which is journalistic malpractice on her part. If you want to be a journalist at one of the highest perches in the world for journalism at the Post, well, you would expect to, verify this quote before you run with it in the paper. So you embarrass the paper, you embarrass yourself, and now you're mad about it. But you mentioned the revolving door, and people are willing to accept that when you talk about lobbying, you talk about the regulation apparatuses and how they have these kind of insiders,
hmm
revolving door. You get a government position, then you go work from the Pfizer board or something, and then you're in charge of regulating, the company that you're on the board of, essentially, this kind of
yeah,
revolving door with lobbying and stuff. And everybody accepts that is true. And, a corrupted and kind of bad practice in our current politics across the board. Most people are like, yeah, that's bad. That's bad. But then you say, well, that also happens in journalism. And they're saying, well, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. These people are, truth tellers, warriors. It's like, well, yeah, Emmanuel, what's his name? Like Rahm Emanuel or whatever.
yeah. Ram, yeah.
Like former governor of Louisiana or something, or
He was the mayor of Chicago.
Chicago. Yeah. And then they use, oh, now he's a political commentator. Let's do somebody from the right, even Chris Christie. These guys, oh, now he's a political commentator. Is he really a political commentator, or is he just a guy that was brought in to do party work? What do you think Chris Christie's going to say? Oh, well, he's going to agree with the Republican side of the argument. It's his job
Yeah.
is to be sitting there and represent this side of the argument. So it's almost like it's not even interesting because you already know, even if he doesn't even believe it, he's going to go down that path, and do it, even if it's not, even if he differs slightly personally on like the
hmm
party line. Well, you're not getting that. So it is this kind of revolving, and these are high salaried positions. These are, you go from being governor, then you get a nice high six-figure salary to be on TV every day and talk
Yeah.
about, it's pretty easy to talk about it too if you don't give a shit about fact. Like it's pretty easy to just
Well,
make it up. But
yeah.
yeah,
If it's all your opinion, or it's the party opinion, one of the, Donna Brazil was a
yeah,
good
yeah,
example, working for the campaign and at the same time working, I think at that time, ABC.
yeah,
And then I think Fox hired her after that. It's like, wait a minute, what are you doing? I
yeah,
mean, she shouldn't have been hired at all. To me, it's like, if you are going to be on TV or working for our media outlet in any way, you're not going to work for a campaign
right.
at any time. It's almost like, here, sign this like you won't in the future, for so many years. Just if you're leaving a media outlet, you're leaving the TV station, yeah, you can leave, but when you do, we've got 6 months where you can't go on another station.
And
Yeah, makes
wasn't
sense.
Wasn't there that scandal during the 2016 or something campaign where one of Hillary's speechwriters was also a commentator on ABC, and he wrote the speech that he was giving commentary on the news network and talking about how it was a great speech and all this kind of stuff. It's like, well, wait a minute, you're the guy that wrote it and you didn't disclose that you're the guy that wrote it. I'm sure he makes a great living being a speechwriter. You can make good money doing that in politics, but like then you're also a commentator. It feels slimy. It feels weaselly. It feels, and when people see that and they find out about it, they don't like it. Americans, I'm obsessed with kind of, American mythology, the kind of like George Washington, the cherry tree, these kind of myths
Yeah.
that have come to shape us, and honesty. Americans do value honesty. And I think something like the George Washington, the cherry tree is a symbol of that. I cannot tell a lie.
Right.
It's kind of a mythical symbol of we value that. And then we kind of when we find out that you're deliberately being dishonest, we do tend to recoil a little bit. We tend to go, like, why are you doing that? You don't have to do that. Like, we're
Right.
America. Like, you can say what you actually think here. And it is just, yeah, I don't know, just something that's like a visceral thing, a reaction when you see that or you notice something like that. So I was just curious. Yeah. And again, that's a tough question to answer. Is the media corrupt? People, oh, what does that mean? What do you mean by media? What do you mean by, and it's like, okay, well, we don't have to
Yeah.
get into all that, but, yeah, it's a tough one to answer. So I was just curious.
Yeah. No, and it's, and you could say, even if you go back just a few years ago, was social media corrupted?
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I think Elon Musk, I wasn't a big fan for years.
Right.
A lot of young people would tell you, Elon Musk, Elon Musk. And maybe it's just, jealousy of this guy doing so much that you kind of recoil against that. But then you see with what became X, Twitter, the fact he put it all on the line,
Yeah.
and I do believe he did for kind of free speech, that people would be able, at times I wish it wasn't so free, like you see the Charlie Kirk stuff
Yeah.
and the conspiracy stuff, and I think, wow, why do we have to put up with that? But he really is, someone who has done a lot for the country as a whole on this whole freedom of speech issue
Yeah.
and opening it up. And we have not only Twitter at the time, you have the Twitter files, and
Yeah.
you have Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg, I think he can't stop doing an apology tour. He
Right.
seems every time, yes, we did it.
Yeah.
The administration told us to stop, doing things, and we cut people out. We changed the algorithm, and you're like, that in itself, you have the government shutting down speech.
Right.
It's kind of scary. I mean, there's some corruption there government wise, but also these guys, billionaires
Yeah.
taking orders from the government. You're like, I would think if I had $1 billion, if I wasn't somewhere you couldn't find me, and I was running a social media outlet, I think I'd say, I don't listen to you. I
Yeah.
do what I want. But, I kind of think that's how, in my mind at least, in the years ago, before the media became what it is now, where yes, I'm the publisher of the Tribune. I decide who we endorse.
Right.
You take that when the LA Times, when the owner out there said, I think it was the LA Times, right, that was endorsing, they were going to endorse Trump. All the editors and all these people, they acted like it was their endorsement. No, we want to go with Kamala, and they end up endorsing nobody, I think.
Right.
But they were talking about a walkout. It's like, 50 years ago, they would have been like, walk.
Yeah.
You want to walk. It's my newspaper. I do it. I decide that page. You guys write the stories. That's
Right.
it. But somewhere along the line, that's become corrupted internally too, and maybe because you have no balance. The percentages, I think it was down to 3% are now, Republicans that are reporters, or they identify that way. And
Yeah.
it's like, whatever that means. So, there's corruption throughout it on different layers, I think.
Yeah, and people that are unfamiliar with the Twitter files there, it was one of those stories that was very big on social media sometimes, but it got very underreported in all the mainstream press outlets and stuff because it was so damning to the Biden DOJ and the Biden administration, what they were trying to do, pressuring these companies under the threat of regulation to pull what they wanted them to pull. And it just was so eye-opening with that too. Like I think people underestimate how big that was when Musk bought Twitter and then let Taibbi and Barry Weiss and some of these other ones come in there, these journalists. Uh, uh, People had no idea. We had a suspicion of certain things, the way these algorithms would act and stuff. They would just suddenly, if you made a certain post that was critical of some like COVID restrictions or something, it would be taken down, or you would see it not get engagement like other stuff. You would see it, the engagement start going down. It's like, okay, well, they're definitely putting their hand on the lever here. But then when they actually exposed it, it was like, okay, now we can prove it. They had lists, they had blacklists, they had people that, like, if you got on there and you were associated with the wrong political side, you were put on a list and you were de-boosted in the algorithm on purpose. And this is during campaign. The big one was the campaign scandal with the Hunter Biden laptop story, these types of stuff during the reelection campaign, where the Twitter locked the New York Post Twitter account for weeks leading up to the election. They weren't allowed access to it because they didn't like that they posted the story on the laptop or whatever. That's very serious, very serious. Like I mean, obviously there's always been some corruption, going back to the Aaron Burr days, but just the levers of power have gotten easier to push because it's consolidated to these few social media companies that own everybody's interaction time. And even Zuckerberg, like I encourage people, if you didn't listen to it, go listen to that first one he did with Rogan, where Rogan really kind of asks him about this and grills, doesn't let him get away with a non-answer. He seems like, again, this is him, so take it with a grain of salt. Maybe he's lying, but he seems like he was naive. He didn't quite understand. Like he said, at first, the government reaches out to him. It was in the middle of COVID, and they were saying, "Oh, this is misinformation. You got to take it down." He's like, my instinct was, okay, like why would they lie to me? Why would they lie to me about this? Sure. And he said, and then all of a sudden it started being, oh, this meme needs to be taken down, or oh, this post that somebody made. He's like, well, hold on a minute. Like he's like, this is not what you said originally, kind of. And then he said, oh, I realized that, I could get a lawyer and be like, no, we're not doing this. And we could go to court over this. I didn't realize that at first. I just assumed that, they were doing the right thing. And he's like, and I didn't. And he said that it really was a wake up, where he said he kind of leans more libertarian now about it, where he said, let people do what they want on there because, the more we get involved in this, the more it's going to cost, the more it's going to be impossible to determine what's true or not, the more it's going to be. And, they always said they didn't want to be in the business of regulating everybody, what people said on their platforms. They wanted to sell ads, like they didn't want to regulate what you could say. And then all of a sudden they were put in this position to do it. And then they did it for a little while. And then they were all just like, okay, we're not doing this anymore. It's too much work. It costs too much money. We have to have these whole review teams. Then there's all this like, appealing processes and stuff that was causing headaches. And it's like, yeah, that costs money. That costs time. Like, for these billion-dollar corporations. It's just so interesting where we are in that, how the media has changed and, stayed the same at the same time, really. But this gets to, I want to ask you about corruption, these last couple of things with the DC swamp. This is the phrase, it's in your book. It's the one Trump was saying, drain the swamp. It's always referred to, and, Trump wasn't the first guy to say that. It has been a term to refer to DC for many, many years, decades. What is the swamp for listeners out there? How do you view it? What is the swamp?
Yeah.
It sounds bad. Yeah. Like,
I think you have different interpretations. Mine, you've got the deep state, which I think is the administration, people who are locked into their jobs, for decades.
Bureaucrats.
Bureaucrats. Good word for it.
Yeah.
But I think the swamp implies more than that. It's not only the bureaucrats that are there, it's the people connected, whether they're elected officials, judges even, and then the media now, I think, is part of that swamp,
right,
where everybody, for a long time, I think they're pulling or pushing in a direction, and Trump was one of the guys to say, no, and that's what we elected now twice. But especially back in 2016, he's this outsider coming in saying, I'm going to drain the swamp. And like you said, not the first guy. Reagan was going to drain the swamp.
Right.
Wasn't successful at it. Kennedy, they had their own battles. John Kennedy, and different parts of it, what they're trying to drain. The bureaucracy, I think Reagan, Kennedy had the CIA and FBI, which certainly, his brother Bobby went toe to toe with. But it even goes back to Lincoln.
Some would argue it got Bobby killed. Yeah,
Yeah, people have argued that. So I think it's bigger than just the bureaucracy. It's, the media's become part of it. It's everybody involved. Lobbyists,
Yeah.
I think, play a big part in it. For a while there, we don't hear much about lobbyists anymore. I think we've turned our attention to the media, to judges now. It's become a big deal, which is sad. As a lawyer, I'm saddened by it because now, not only do I have to fact check on reporters, but I'll see, some judge issued an injunction, like you see the name, like, okay, who appointed that one?
Yeah.
90% of the time it's the other party, whatever side you're on.
Yeah.
So you're basically, we're not going by the law anymore, I think. There's some rare instances, but a lot of times, no. It's much like the reporting. They've kind of joined in with the party. So we got this big, blob of a swamp where, they're all fighting really against, I would agree with Trump. It's against the people. It's not so much him. If someone else was there, they'd be fighting them too. So,
and you see this, I think the judges. No, please go on.
What Trump, I think one of the things he says is, I'm just in the way. They're really coming after you, which is kind of brilliant.
Yeah.
He's with us. He doesn't get the credit sometimes for the political instincts.
Yeah. Yeah. Great marketer. Yeah. Great marketer for that. And you need that. You need that in politics. Yeah. It's interesting thinking about that. It makes me think of this kind of the swamp itself, because everybody says, oh, the deep state. And then obviously there's skepticism about that and what people mean different things by this. So it's just interesting how that plays out with all of these, because, they're like, oh, it's corrupt. It's a swamp. And it's like, well, there are levels to this too, right? It's not like the judges, especially, I think in the news more recently, where we're seeing this tendency to, really in regards to criminal justice and stuff, where the criminal trials, the people are seeing judges be what they feel is too lenient on repeat offenders and things like that right now. And it appears that and even if they're not doing it for corruption reasons, they're doing it for ideological reasons. And that makes people upset, where they're just like, you're supposed to be an impartial judge on this thing. And here you're letting this kind of your ideology about what should happen, supersede the law that's on the books, the precedent, all of that you're supposed to be doing for like a judge. And then people confuse it, right? Where they confuse the Supreme Court that's more philosophical, making these kind of judgments with, a trial lawyer that's literally handing down, sentencing.
Yeah.
Whereas the Supreme Court, they argue for hours more philosophically, and not, kind of that kind of criminal court style. But yeah, I think that one's the big one too, where you're seeing the judge. Maybe it's just because we're seeing it more because there is no local reporting. So almost everything is national now. Maybe we're just seeing it more. Maybe it's just the really egregious cases where you're seeing these people that, were arrested 15 times, let out of jail, and then they kill somebody else. And it's like, okay, well, what are we doing here? Why did the judge even think that, being somebody who you assume is smart, went to law school, understands things, understands the partisan divides, understands this stuff, and has to weigh all this. It's a tough position too. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a tough thing to do, to be a federal judge or whatever, or even a local judge. It comes down to you. You're the decision maker. That can be a lot of pressure, but not everybody gets to do. There's a reason you got put into that job, is because that's what the job is. We're like, oh, you're going to handle this job.
Yeah.
You got to make the decision and be fair as you can. And yeah,
it's an important job. And when they do have discretion, I think we just saw it with the gentleman. And I don't know why I'm calling him a gentleman, but the guy who was accused of, stalking Kavanaugh with the intent to kill him, and I think was stopped outside his house.
Yeah, if
I recall the facts.
And his family was in hiding after that. He didn't stay at his house for I think a month or something. His family was fleeing, and he has younger kids. Yeah.
And you talk about you see the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and you think, was that intended to shut up a movement? Right. But also going after judges, especially Supreme Court justices, who, there's been a lot of back and forth over politics over the years, many years.
Here comes Mitch McConnell again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And yeah, and you see that and you're like, okay, and people blame the Supreme Court whether they know the law or not. They've
Right.
decided they've decided this because they're with Trump, or they decided it because they're against Trump, or whatever. And then you get this judge 4 years for trying to kill a Supreme Court justice. There's people, our Speaker of the House here in Illinois just had 7.5 years for corruption, but the corruption was he was getting his workers, his precinct workers, jobs with the electricity company,
Right.
and that's how they were getting paid by them. He wasn't taking money himself. No, I'm not saying his corruption's okay, but you look at that, and you're like, wait a minute, he got 7.5 years. This other guy was trying to kill a Supreme Court justice.
Right.
Different courthouses, but I got to think you get more years for that, for trying to kill someone. Not, I don't want to see corruption flourish, but
Right.
maybe if we reverse those sentences, I don't know.
Yeah, that's, Sam Harris always makes this argument all the time, and I'm a fan of Sam Harris, and he would always say, our entire legal system is based on intentions. It is based on degree and intentions, first degree murder, second degree murder, third degree, these based around, did you mean to do it? Was it an accident? How did you plan it out? Like how did this come to be? Did you intend to do it? Did you not intend to do it? Was it an accident? How malicious, how severe was it? Like all of these things are constantly weighed. And this is what makes our justice system, kind of the envy of the world. And this is that we do take into consideration all of the little things that matter in terms of sentencing. And of course, sometimes better than others, but yeah, it's just so crazy how that's playing out right now. So, I mean, it's just interesting to look back through history with your book too, to do this. And I know we're bumping up against time here, Dennis. So thank you for hanging with us all this time. The last
Sure.
question I wanted to ask, and this is kind of a big one, and again, another tough one to answer. We like those types of questions on this podcast. Would you say that, is the United States corrupt? Is it a corrupt institution, a corrupt state? Is it on its way to being a corrupt state?
Yeah, that is a tough one. I think,
Yeah, answer it however you feel. Yeah, however you feel.
when people, I kind of look at it like no matter how bad it gets, whatever side you're on, it's still the best system,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And you're going to have instances of corruption. I think it's all of our jobs to figure out how to weed it out of whole industries.
Right.
Like if everybody thinks, well, all politicians are crooks. I don't think that. I've met some guys that are not crooks. Not only were they not convicted, but I really believe they were honest, trying to serve at different levels. And I think so when you just put a label on it, we have issues for sure. And I think unfortunately maybe some of this has been there in the Trump presidencies, now we can call it plural,
Right.
are bringing some of it up, to the forefront where we're more aware of it. We're more aware of the issues with the media. I'd like to see that fixed.
Yeah.
Judges, I don't understand at the federal level, they're lifetime appointments. You should at least be willing to put politics aside
Right.
when you get to that level, and you're not looking to say, well, I'll issue. One of the things that always drove me crazy is they all started issuing these, injunctions that were for every district. Wait a minute, you're in the district in San Francisco. It's good for your case, that district maybe, but it doesn't apply to me. And somehow that became, commonplace.
Right.
And like, well, that's a problem. So all these problems, I think we get through it as a
Right.
country. I think that overall we don't have a choice because this is the best system. It's the greatest country I think we've ever seen on earth. But we're going to have to put up with corruption here and there at times until we fix it. And
Yeah.
it's on everybody to fix it.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Amy Wax at all? That Penn law professor who she had a big free speech case where she eventually got fired from her tenured job there. Uh, for other reasons, but she had this great, she's kind of a firebrand, very prickly woman. This woman didn't take shit from anyone. Like she was a very kind of intimidated people when she was talking, very whip smart, but of course she was conservative. So that caused problems at her when in the more recent years. But she made this statement where she would say that, the argument that got her really in trouble around 2016 was she wrote a book about, bourgeois values, essentially, and how those led to the West prospering in this sense, and what is valued by these cultures. And one of the examples she made was, yes, there's corruption in the United States and in the Western world. She's like, but if you look at it compared to all the rest of the world, she's like, it is relatively low corruption. There's a few things here and there, but how do you get to a system where there's relatively low corruption compared to these other, what's holding back some of these countries, the ones that are second world coming up into the first world, industrializing, Brazil, India, even China to some extent there with the kind of stuff like, well, what's preventing them from achieving what, all of the other Western countries? And so, well, it's kind of the corruption, like in the government where they're not letting good things happen and they're getting too corrupt. So yeah. I mean, people I think exaggerate. Oh, it's corrupt, but like I think your answer is right. Where there's pockets, right? There's pockets of things that are pretty bad, but we usually kind of sniff those out, and there's a huge scandal when they break. So the system isn't totally broken either. Like the journalistic system, even though we just criticized it for a few hours here, there is still a part of it that still works. It does sniff things out, that are, maybe it takes a decade or something, but it does come out and people are scandalized, and there's usually something that happens. So, not all hope is lost either with
Right.
this. Yeah. It's just, so I think that's appropriate with this. Yeah. Dennis, this has been a fantastic time. Where can people find you? Websites, social media handles, book?
Yeah. I'm on my book. I can show you the cover.
Fantastic.
It's available, as they say, where all good books are sold, including Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, my own website, which is authordennisbrennan.com. I'm on Facebook and on X, although I'm told I'm going to start being on other things. Yeah. Because I've been slow to the party to get on those things. I know the Twitter handle is at Dennis Brennan 61.
Fantastic.
That I do know.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you what the one is for Facebook, but I'm on there. I think if you put in my name, you find it eventually. There is a more famous Dennis Brennan who's a singer. That is not me. I was told to quit singing everywhere I went. Oh, that's not me.
Yeah. And that's all linked below as well, listeners. You go down there, click the link to get his book, and all his socials are down there as well. Dennis Brennan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a great time. I mean, we just barely scratched the surface of your book too. And we can only do so much in a few hours here, but yeah, really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I enjoy being on and love the conversation.
Yeah. Please come back, for that next book. Please come back anytime.
I will. Now you're stuck with me.
Of course. Yeah.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources. American resources.
Being bored,
Some activities are intentional, right?
it shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.